SYS presents Adventures in Online Education.
Hello, friends. You're listening to SYS Presents Adventures in Online Education. I'm your host, Natalie Conway. Thanks for being here. On today's episode, I have the pleasure of speaking with Nate Ridgway. Nate is a tech-loving history teacher from Indianapolis, Indiana, and author of 2 books on teaching, Don't Ditch That Tech, Differentiation in a Digital World, and Breaking the Blockbuster Model, using Edtech and Accessibility to see what's next in classrooms. He was the Indiana Connected Educator of the Year in 2020, and his work has been featured in such publications as the New York Times and Washington Post. He also holds a master's degree in history from the University of Indianapolis. Today, Nate and I talk about old pedagogical models and new ones, and he explains how his new book helps educators to navigate through it all. We'll learn what the blockbuster model is and how we can learn from the streaming model to make online learning awesome. So, you ready? Let's learn something new. Good afternoon, Nate Ridgway. Thank you so much for being here. I am very excited to talk with you today.
Oh, thanks so much for having me, Natalie. It's great to be here.
I can't wait for our audience to hear from you today. For those who might not be familiar with your work, just to get them a little more familiar with who you are and what you do and all of those things. So let's dive in. We know we learn so many pedagogical approaches when we're studying to become educators, and some of those practices totally stand the test of time. And others not so much. And some just move maybe from our go-to strategy to one of many approaches we take in the classroom. So for instance, I've had, I think, a complicated relationship, we could say, with direct instruction over the years. As a special education teacher, I was trained in direct instruction as a means to help students just quickly learn basic knowledge or skills. And that was my go-to thing for a really long time. And it's not the same anymore, and I think differently about it now. But if educators in education was just the filling of a bucket, direct instruction would be all we needed. But kids aren't computers. Teachers aren't, well, many teachers aren't programmers. What are some kind of old school instructional strategies that you think have stood the test of time? And are there any that we should just leave in the history books?
Yeah, definitely. I think so. That's kind of the thing that's complicated about education, right? Is that it's literally been along since humans have existed, right?
Right.
But there's some things that, as you said, have really stood the test of time. So, for example, like the influence of a teacher, right? Like we know based on all the studies and the evidence that the influence of a teacher is profoundly impactful. But then there's other things that I think that are new, that are relatively recent, that are also really good developments, right? Like, so for example, like UDL, like Universal Design for Learning, is something that I'm very passionate about, and it's very helpful. But at the same time, there's also lots of old things that need to be getting rid of, right? Or they need to be, re-examined and looked at. So I think there's kind of like in education, we tend to hit this paradigm where there's lots of old stuff that just because it's old, it doesn't necessarily mean it's good. And there's lots of new stuff that just because it's new, it also doesn't mean that it's good. Because
Good point.
yeah, so
Yeah.
I've, for me, like right now, because I'm just about to start the school year tomorrow, I think there's 2 really destructive things. Like one is like looking at practice or is continuing practices that we don't look at, right? That's incredibly dangerous. The second thing that's really risky, I think, is adopting this flavor of the month style of PD that doesn't have any kind of longevity to it. And as educators, you feel like you're just kind of like getting hit like a ping pong back, bouncing back and forth between like, oh, now this is our focus. Now this is our focus. And it's hard to get a grounding in anything. So in terms of like things like with direct instruction, specifically itself that need to be looked at. I mean, yeah, like if direct instruction, like if education were the filling of a bucket, right? There's just simple transference. It would be a lot easier, you would think, right? If the solution were just that simple.
Right.
But we know based off of educational psychology and whether that's, going back to looking at Atkinson and Trifkin's, model of, information processing, where they talk about, like, oh, like we need time for rehearsal and elaboration and these kind of things. Or if we look at the complicated nature of, culturally relevant pedagogy, right? And the complexity that's needed to understand that, we know that transference isn't just that simple. So there's a couple of things that I would kind of recommend that we need to do with direct instruction that needs to have a look at. One is, I think there is a big misconception out there, and this is something that I actually wrote about in the book, Breaking the Blockbuster Model, that simply exposure to information equates to meaningful learning. And that is not true at all. Simply being exposed to the information doesn't mean that an individual is going to be able to meaningfully use that information or be able to recall that information, even on a very basic level, later when they need it. For example, like what happens like with a lot of direct instruction, at least in my own classroom circumstances, is that like, for example, like I'll do a 10 to 15 minute mini lesson with kids. And then we'll come back maybe, 10 or 15 minutes later and you'll do a quick formative assessment, see what we learned, and it's been lost, right? And so there's kind of an issue there that's going on. I think one of the studies that's especially relevant in this area, I'm going to totally butcher the name, but it was a study that I came across in the book, and it was DESLAURIES. It's like Desloriers et al. They did this study back in 2016, and they compared two groups of students who were involved in direct instruction. The first group was exposed just basically to straight up direct instruction, right? And then they were assessed at the end to see what their learning was. The second group was actually not involved in direct instruction. So they were not like the norm, so to speak, in the study. What they were involved in is they were involved in collaborative learning. And then they were also assessed on what they learned. So what was really interesting about the outcomes of the study that the researchers found was that the group who was exposed to direct instruction perceived that they had learned more from it, but when they were actually assessed on it, they had actually learned less. And the group that was involved in collaborative learning, so like really good interactive activities, discussion, these kind of things, right? They perceived that they actually had learned less compared to the other group, but then they actually, when the numbers were looked at, they actually had learned more. And so what's really fascinating about that study for me is that just simply being exposed to information doesn't mean that you can necessarily use it in a meaningful way. And also for students, if we do provide these interactive learning opportunities that aren't direct instruction, whether that's collaborative work or, one-on-one coaching or, whatever it is, we need to make sure that we take some of those more peer-to-peer collaborative learning opportunities and really hammer down on some of the concrete takeaways that students should learn from that. So yeah, the direct instruction in particular is something that's, it falls under, when I was writing the book, it falls under this movie theater model. It is the oldest way that we had, ideally consumed media in that way. And it's not necessarily that it's bad, it's just in need of some renovations. Like, we need to take a look at everything from how do we provide support and scaffolding during direct instruction to like, when is the best time to use it, to, giving students time to meaningfully process what they've learned after direct instruction. So it just doesn't, disappear, like that study had with those, with those students. So I think it needs a really good, hard look at in particular as one of our oldest educational strategies.
Absolutely. I completely agree. And I really appreciate you bringing up that study because it's fascinating. And it just reminds me of how learning can look and feel so many different
Yeah.
ways. And I think sometimes students get used to the direct
Mm-hmm.
instruction model and they think that that is how learning
Yeah.
happens. Like, this is how I have to learn this. The teacher tells me how to do it. We do a couple examples together and then I do a bunch on my own and and that's it. Like, I just, whatever. And to engage kids in more collaborative instruction, like you were talking about, feels to the student very different.
Mm-hmm.
And it might feel more effortful. It might feel less, who knows? But it's interesting that engaging in those little mini productive struggles still shows, even in this study, like, okay, yeah, you're going to actually learn more. You've internalized more of this. You actually understand it.
And it causes a whole bunch of, extenuating problems beyond that, because students perceive that they learn more during direct instruction, that means that then we get, as teachers, we get bombarded by well, just tell me what I need to know, like quotes, right? Where it's like, no, just please make me a study guide that's the exact same questions as what's on the quiz. I'll just look at that. And they think that simply having that information visible or made transparent means that it somehow becomes meaningfully encoded in their brain. And it's just not the case. Like what I tell my students all the time is that, like having the information in front of you or directly taught to you is a lot like having, like when you're like wanting to go somewhere and you pull it up on Google Maps, like it'll show you exactly like where you need to go and like what turns you need to make. But that's a lot different than making the journey yourself and traveling the distance to understand like how you could do that. Right. Because and what I tell the kids is like, now turn off your internet and Wi-Fi and could you do the route yourself? Much different.
Right. Heck no, if you're
Yeah.
me.
Yeah, me too. I use it as growth.
I appreciate what you said also about like, we don't have to throw everything out just because it's
No.
old. Doesn't mean it's good or bad,
Mhm.
and just because it's new doesn't mean it's the new shiny thing, because those tried and true things like the influence of a teacher, like the relationships teachers and students have together and students have with one another, that community building within a class is so important. And then the things that might sound new to folks like UDL, which anyone who's listened to our podcast for an amount of time has heard UDL for sure. But if that is a new concept to someone, it doesn't have to be that you're throwing out everything you've already done. Or if you think of culturally responsive teaching or, whatever these words or phrases or ideas are that we are conceptualizing now and labeling really explicitly, it's not that you're not doing those. It's becoming aware of what aspects you are engaging with and maybe where you could be doing some more work, those kinds of things. So I think it's really important for teachers to hear as well. Just because something is new in name to you doesn't necessarily mean it's actually new in practice. And then building that awareness of what we're doing is so important.
They may already be doing lots of those things, just, we're backing it up with a theoretical framework now, right?
Absolutely. Yes. We're going to take a quick break, and when we come back, we are going to talk a little bit more about breaking the blockbuster model. So stick with us, friends. What's the one thing all online schools and programs struggle with? Student engagement and the ability to truly personalize interventions. How do we solve those problems? With the use of Admin Dash, a brand new Canvas LTI tool from SYS Education. Admin Dash allows online teachers to see a risk assessment score that proactively identifies students who may need more specialized attention or intervention, and offers a communication log that provides an outlet for complete transparency among teachers, admin, students, and families. At just 99 cents per student per year, and with no minimum price and no fees, you can't afford to not use Admin Dash. For more information about Admin Dash, contact sales@syseducation.org and start connecting proactively with your online learners. Welcome back, online educators. I am talking to Nate Ridgway. We are going to dive into his book next. Not surprisingly, I personally find that teachers are some of the best authors of texts for educators. We learn so much from one another, and we know you're speaking from experience, and an experience that we've had too. So you've written a second book entitled Breaking the Blockbuster Model, using Edtech and Accessibility to see what's next in classrooms. I'm curious what you see the future of EdTech looking like for online students in particular.
I think for online students in particular, there is a dramatic need to look at a few fundamental things. One is digital equity, such as for example, like the ability for universal broadband access, right? And here in Indiana, a lot of folks so I'm from central Indiana, like the Indianapolis area, which is kind of like smack dab in the middle of the state for people who, don't know where Indianapolis is exactly on the map. But like you get outside of Indianapolis and some people, and even inside parts of Indianapolis, like the percentage of students that have consistent access to high-speed internet is a particular issue that really does concern me. I think the second thing, though, on a more like teacher classroom level, that's much more fundamental and important, is in some ways the continuation of lots of the good things that we do as educators anyways. So whether that's giving time for meaningful processing or collaboration. There's lots of apps and new ed tech opportunities out there that are starting to provide easier ways to do that, whether that's your Google Suite or Microsoft Suite, or sometimes apps that don't fall into those things like like Pear Deck or things like that, right? I think outside of those kind of like continuing on the good things that we do as educators, I think there's an opportunity that especially digital education can do some things that in-person instruction cannot do, and those things need to be really pushed hard. And so this is something that I get to in the third section of my book. So kind of for those who, well, I hope, read it. The book's basically broken down into three metaphors. So we have the movie theater model, which looks at like some very long-standing practices in education, mostly centered around direct instruction and things like that. The blockbuster model looks at, I'm using blockbuster as a metaphor, those things that we assumed, like, so myself as a millennial, that I always thought was going to be there. And as educators, we always think are going to be there. So things like, for example, like homework or, late work or, like what our grading practices are like, right? Or, assumptions about, work ethic and things like that. And it looks at that. And then the last chapter gets into what I want to talk about here in this section, which is the streaming model. And so something that I came up with, this is back in 2015, when I was teaching in a high poverty school here in Indianapolis. A teacher came to me and said, like, hey, like, you do a lot with, like, I noticed you use like a lot of EdTech apps and stuff like that. Have you ever thought about like flipping your classroom before? And I'm like, oh, okay, yeah, sure. I mean, I've heard about flipping, like, I heard about it like back in the early 2000s. I was like, I haven't looked into it much about, since then. Okay, cool. And like, I started looking into like, flipping a classroom more. And it was like, you just get this mantra about flipping a classroom, right? Which is direct instruction at home, collaborative stuff in class. And I was like, okay, well, that's all fine and good, but like, that isn't exactly changing the dynamic in a very positive way. Like we could leverage this even more. And so what I came up with, and eventually I finally was able to give it a name, was cloning. And so what I do now in terms of my instruction, this is what I started doing back then, was students had the opportunity to attend my dual credit US history class in person or online, as long as their grades qualified them for it. And so they could literally like leave early at the at the end of the day, or come in late at the end of the day. For me, what cloning actually looks like is whether a student is in class or not, right? And especially this became really powerful during COVID in particular, because I had students out on quarantine, or like they had to stay home because like they needed to provide healthcare, for childcare for their families when they were sick. What it basically means, cloning is that whether a student comes in person or they're online, they're going to get the closest possible experience to like me being next to them there teaching. And so like if a kid walks in, what we're working on in class, like the same Google Slides is up there on the screen that they would have with me. There's a YouTube video there that they could use in class or at home. I had an IORAD tutorial, which is a tutorial making thing they could also use. I have the slides translated in Spanish because I had a high Spanish speaking population that they could also utilize that, either in class or at home. And so what I was basically doing, and this is like where I think EdTech is starting to go, is being able to bridge some of those equity and accessibility gaps that we previously could not do. And I think then this kind of leads me to my last point that I was going to make, that I think we're starting to get, especially with online education, we have these opportunities to leverage this platform in ways that we could have not done like even like 10 or 15 years ago. And so like in the book, I use, the streaming model as an example of this, but like streaming services are so good about meeting viewers where they want to watch. So it's like, do you want to watch Succession on your Amazon Alexa while you're cooking? Sure. And then you're like, well, now I want to get in the hot tub. And it's like, oh, well, you can watch it on your phone there. And Succession is like, we'll make that happen. And then you're like, nope, now I'm switching over to Hulu because I'm going to bed and I'm going to jump over to that. And so like, then you can like pull it up on your TV with like, literally 3 clicks, right? So streaming services are so good about meeting viewers where they want to be and where they would like to go. And I think that's something that's incredibly important for educators too, because your students are going to find out the information in some way. And you probably would rather it be through you than, Wikipedia, right? Or, some person's random blog posting about, a topic that they don't have expertise on. And so I think there's an opportunity for online education that way. And I think too, more fundamentally, but this is really only possible with online education to an extent. It can happen in person, but not as much, is where we get these very personalized learning streams of info. So like, for example, like if you go and I don't know, you watch like a murder mystery on Netflix, as soon as you finish that, they're like, would you like to watch 6 other shows that are exactly the same thing and you would totally dig? And as educators, like especially in an online setting, because students have that freedom of time and also they have agency, to be able to express their choice, they can stay engaged on stuff that really interests them, and we can leverage that interest in a much more powerful way. So like if you have kids who are like, I had a student who was like doing an environmental unit, and then we had to, kind of turn that into, students had to explore a current day problem, right? And so I had a student who was super fascinated for whatever reason on what was the most green way you could die. And I was like, that's a fascinating question I've never thought about. So like they did like all the digging themselves on like what about funeral versus cremation? Well, and then eventually they discovered the most green way to die is there's these coffins made out of fungus. And I was like, that's crazy and really interesting and cool. But like, because of my ability to have that in a more digital setting compared to the past, my students are actually able to do that work compared to a traditional classroom textbook setup, right? So I know that was like a long-winded answer, but I think that's some of the opportunities that of where education is going that we can really push the bar higher.
And there are so many cool ed tech tools out there that would support
Mm-hmm.
that, right? I mean, you can be cruising around Google Earth and discover things, or
Yeah.
you can like there's just so much that you can possibly do, or collaborating on a Pear Deck or something like that. But I think you hit the nail on the head with time and agency. In a fully online program, you're not stuck at the computer with an adult from 8 to 3 or 7 to 2 or
Yeah.
whatever your day looks
Hopefully
like,
not.
right?
That's a
Yeah,
long time.
you should not be. So you have that freedom that you don't in a brick and mortar setting, and kids do have a high level of choice, and we as educators in an online setting have so much choice ourselves as well. So if we're teaching to standards and not to a certain curriculum or a certain idea that we had for a lesson, if we're teaching to standards, kids can come up with their own essential questions like your
Mm-hmm.
student did. And that's remarkable. And again, that is going back to what we talked to before the break about learning looking differently, right? And that's amazing learning that probably didn't feel as effortful as like reading a chapter out of a book and trying to memorize a bunch of facts and making flashcards,
I
right?
would
Like,
hope not, right? It's something that was totally like driven by them. And honestly, like
yeah.
that's why we binge watch stuff on Netflix and Hulu and Amazon Prime and whatever else, because not only can we express that agency, right, in a way like we're given choice, right? But we're
Mhm.
also done so we're given that choice in a context of you can do this when you want to. And those two things really drive engagement.
Absolutely. Feeling in control and
Hmm.
feeling purposeful about it. Like, yeah, I'm going to watch this at
Yeah,
this time because that's going to work for me. And
exactly.
having that respect, I think that lends itself to showing mutual respect between teacher and student as well. Like, hey, I respect you and your time and that you have a life outside of my class and go do this when it works for you. And that's very in honor of students as humans and
Hmm.
individuals. So that is so cool. I appreciate all your analogies, like the blockbuster model, those things we thought were going to be around forever. It's like
Hmm.
the Choco Taco or the, I
Oh
don't know,
yeah, no, I
any
saw
of
the news about
those.
that. Yes.
It makes us a little sad when things aren't going to
Yeah,
stay the
I
same.
know. And that's something about PD generally. That's like when I wrote this book, I really wanted to be a blend of the theoretical and the practical so that not only
Hmm.
can you like say like, okay, I know the theory that some of this stuff is based on, but you actually have like an implementable way that you can do these things.
Absolutely. That's what teachers are always looking for, right? We want,
Hmm.
that sounds great. That's brilliant. I agree. Now what do I do? How do
Yeah.
I do this
How can I
next
use this
week?
tomorrow?
Yes. And you provide that. All of your work is so actionable for those who consume it. And I really appreciate that. Nate, I have one final question for you. It's a question I'm asking all guests this season. If there was one thing, material or otherwise, that you could give to every teacher in the US today, what would it be and why?
Ooh, man, I would say the first one would just be time, and maybe like a bit of a shred of respect that we feel like we're deserved. Like maybe both of those two things. That would be nice. But if I were to spin it like more positively, I think the biggest thing that I wish we all as educators could have, or at least time to do and the freedom to do, is to be more reflective. And like that's something that I take to heart in a very deliberate way in my classroom. I try to be very reflective and I encourage my students to be so as well. But, learning in the absence of reflection is meaningless. Like it doesn't do anything. Like I was sitting in a PD for a school this last week that they were doing, and they presented all this data that they had uncovered on systemic racism in discipline, and then they just gave the data, and then they didn't do anything about it. They just gave the teachers the data, and they just like, yep, and that's the end of the meeting. And I'm like,
Oh
what?
no.
Like, no, you can't do that. So like you can't be equipped with, whether it's a strategy in your classroom, or it's data that you've collected from an assessment, or an action that if it's a strategy you tried, or a lesson you tried, or it's an app you tried to use one day, and then just say, yep, like moving on. Like, and you can't just do that without do that in a vacuum. It has to be paired with like reflection and then action about changing that particular thing. So yeah, besides time and some respect, I'd say reflection.
Awesome. I love that answer. Time to reflect, and
Yes.
that's
Yes.
when we internalize everything. That's when we decide what's worthy of maintaining in our
Mm-hmm.
memories and what's going to be let go and all of that. And
Exactly.
we own it, we make it our own. So yeah, if we could all just find that time or make that time to reflect on our days, on our work with kids, our work with our teacher peers, all of that, that'd be amazing. Nate, you have such awesome insight for educators. If folks want to find out more about you, your books, your work, get in touch with you, where can they find you?
So the easiest way is probably on Twitter. So I'm on Twitter. It's at Teach from Ridge, spelled exactly how you would think it sounds. And then my blog that is linked to the book is breakingblockbuster.com, and you can discover everything about me and the book there, as well as I believe I've also provided a link to like the preface if people want to try to and read that first and get a kind of a taste of the book before they buy. So
Awesome. And we'll have links to all of that in our show notes as well. So, listeners, you can find Nate there. Awesome. Thank you so much for this conversation. I had a blast and I wish you all the best this year.
oh, thank you. It's going to be a good year.
Thanks for listening to this episode of SYS Presents Adventures in Online Education. Special thanks to my guest today, Nate Ridgway. Nate taught us that collaboration is key to learning and that we can never underestimate the influence of a teacher on student success. He taught us how to use our online systems to personalize learning for kids and leverage time and agency to everyone's advantage. If you liked what you heard today, please hit subscribe and give us a 5-star rating. Want to connect? On Twitter, you can follow the show at SYS Presents. We love hearing from you. If you're interested in finding out more about SYS Education and our products and services, head to syseducation.org. Lastly, this podcast wouldn't be possible without our exceptional team at SYS Education, including our dream team consisting of sound engineer Natalie Farrell, graphic designer and social media and website manager Lexi Boren, and producer Bo Neal. Thanks for listening today. And remember, we can learn new things.
in